In this episode, I want to talk to you a little bit about the history of Latin American football in the FIFA World Cup and what your thoughts of this tournament are. But before we do this, and certainly I want to know what the atmosphere in Buenos Aires is like, and why did you decide to set up your program, the South American Football Show?
Yeah, it's absolutely crazy last night. Well, the whole of yesterday in Buenos Aires. I'm here right now in Buenos Aires. I came here by bus, 48 hours on bus from La Paz to be able to watch the final and yeah, share some of the images of the collective joy there has been here. You know, with this historic win, this very emotional win. Obviously, for the football world, the fact that it's Messi's last World Cup, and it being the tournament of his life, I think has been very touching for a lot of people. But also, you know, for the country as well, I think it means a lot. It's been a pretty bad year for Argentina generally. The hangover of the IMF period under Macri, the government hasn't been able to lift the country out of the mess that was left by the neoliberal President Macri. There's record high inflation, currently the highest inflation in South America, higher monthly inflation in Venezuela. You know, there's been the assassination attempt against Cristina we saw a couple months ago, and there was a sense, and on the way over here, there's an Argentinian guy who's telling me that uh, if Argentina lose, then there's going to be like, then the government could collapse. But if they win, then they're going to stay on and they're going to be strengthened. So, and I think that gives a sense of how on edge Argentinians were. But yeah, and in terms of the show, we have a YouTube show we set up called the South American Football Show. We set up with the World Cup, and now that the World Cup's over, hope to continue it, shine a light a bit, perhaps on talk about the history of South American football, the interesting histories there are, South American club football, which I think people in Europe, North America don't pay much attention to, but which I think is incredible. I think the craziest football fans you'll see anywhere in the world, you'll find in South America, specifically Argentina. Clubs like Boca Juniors and River Plate is a level of popular passion. I don't think you'll see anywhere else in any other field.
Mm-hmm. The 2002, the 2022 FIFA World Cup has been won, of course, by Argentina, headed by Lionel Messi. His performance, of course, was outstanding. But I'm just interested, what do you think they actually got right in this tournament? Why was Argentina able to win?
I think it was just the. I mean, I would be the first to say that I don't think Argentina is the best team in this tournament on a technical level. I think the Brazil team we saw, if you go player by player, was probably superior, on paper. But the difference with Argentina was just the raw passion. I think was the way the players came around Messi, the Messi's leadership himself, the fact that they knew that that the country needed this, that their people would go wild. Just a raw, just I don't know, like just brute force, just brute force and belief, and the feeling that especially because I think they lost the first game, obviously against Saudi Arabia, which was a big shock. And then after that, every game was a life or death game, because if they lost any or drew any further matches, they might not have qualified from their group. So every game became a kind of life or death game. It's first in the group, and then obviously in the knockout stages. It's a knockout. If you lose, you're out. So that's then, I think, when Argentina's a team that when they feel like they're the better team, where they get complacent, and that's what happened, I think, with Saudi Arabia. But after that game against Saudi Arabia, it was life or death, fighting for their lives, and that's when I think Argentinians thrive really. This is very different to some Brazilians. Brazilians thrive when they're happy, when they're comfortable, you know, with all their skills and stuff. But Argentinians thrive, I think, in feeling like the underdog, in kind of I don't want to say misery, but when they feel like they're down, that's when I think the Argentinian spirit shines through. And I think that goes for culture in general, you know, when you compare Argentina and Brazil.
Mhm. Comparisons, of course, between Lionel Messi and the great Diego Armando Maradona will continue to be made. For people outside of Argentina and Latin America who are unfamiliar with his legacy, why does Maradona continue to capture people's imagination? And what in particular does he mean for the political left in the region?
But yeah, I mean, I think certainly on the pitch, the two can be compared. I mean, they play pretty similar styles, obviously, and I think that in terms of quality, they definitely can be compared. There's a debate, I think, over who's better. It's difficult to have that debate because in the 80s and things, football was very different. Um, Different in a lot of ways. I think obviously players weren't as at a high technical level then, but also the game was a lot rougher. I mean, you see videos of Maradona playing, people just absolutely taking him out in a way that would be completely illegal today. So I think it's not a question of it was his football was easier back then. But obviously he was part of then, and the fact that you know he stood head and shoulders above everyone else is important. But obviously Messi, I think, is someone who shines on the pitch, but lives a quiet life off the pitch. I mean, he's pretty famous as someone who is very humble, who doesn't get into sort of scandals or he doesn't make any political statements ever. He doesn't put himself in controversy of any kind. He just wants the focus to be on the football. Whereas Maradona obviously had a massive life off the pitch. I mean, people will know about the struggle he had with drugs, all sorts of scandals. But also, he was someone who wasn't afraid to state his political views that would make him a target for the elites, for the media. Obviously, he was great friends with Fidel Castro, Evo Morales, Hugo Chavez. In the 2018 election campaign in Venezuela, he got on stage and danced with Nicolas Maduro. Now something that obviously the Argentinian media absolutely attacked him for in an extreme way. But he didn't care. He wore his heart on his sleeve, and there was also a sense that I think he represents the Argentinian spirit quite well in that he thrived in being the underdog, in standing with the underdogs. He is someone who perhaps outside Argentina people would just see him as obviously a white person, but within Argentina and the sort of racial politics that exist in Argentina, he was called it's called a negro, called indigenous, and he took it as a badge of honor and called himself that. In he went to play in Italy as well, club football to Napoli, and Napoli is also within Italy is a place that's quite discriminated against culturally. It's sort of seen as poor and dirty, and that's what he loved about it. And today, if you go to Napoli, he's a god. He's seen as one of them. You see murals and statues for Maradona all over the place. I think the Napoli team now actually has Maradona on their shirt. And yeah, he identified always with the underdog. And there's loads of stories. Like I remember one. Apparently, he wanted to do like a charity event for a kid in Napoli who had like cancer or something. And the club sort of didn't want to do it. So I thought, we've got enough on our plate. Well, so he just organised it himself, and he went to play on a dirt pitch near the guy's house in Napoli. Like the biggest athlete and most famous athlete in the world is going to play on the neighborhood dirt pitch with the kid and his friends. And yeah, it's just stuff like that is something that characterizes him. and he represents a movement. He represents, he's an iconic figure of Latin American culture and struggle. And I think if, while he was alive, obviously he died 2 years ago. I've got a friend who says this is the year 2 AD, 2 years after Diego. And that's why, it was so important for Argentina to win. But, when he was alive, he walks through, working class areas of Buenos Aires or Argentina. And, it was just a god, it's a god. There's no one, perhaps Michael Jackson or something has that level of fame, but I don't think many other people do.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorite Maradona quotes was when he went to Japan and apparently, or attempted to go to Japan to watch the World Cup, and they put a ban on him, and he said, they're banning me for doing drugs, but they're not banning Henry Kissinger and the Americans, considering that they dropped 2 atomic bombs on the country. So that ability of him to just speak his mind and many times just say things that were quite on point are interesting. Now, the beautiful game, of course, has a rather ugly side. This FIFA World Cup was critiqued for hosting the tournament in Qatar, as the country came under criticisms for its treatment of immigrant workers and its general human rights record. In 1978, FIFA held the World Cup in Argentina, which was gripped by a brutal US-backed military dictatorship that was accused of bribing and threatening the Peruvian national team in order for Argentina to obtain a victory over them and progress in the tournament. What are your views of FIFA as an organization, and what about its relationship to Latin America?
Well, I think, if you ask anyone in the world what the first word that comes to mind when you say FIFA is probably the word corruption. But I think it's important to state that the corruption didn't start now. It didn't start with this World Cup. It's an open secret that pretty much every World Cup that has ever been was awarded on the basis of bribery and corruption. Whether including the World Cup in Germany, including the World Cup in South Africa, this. I do find it. I think there's, of course, the treatment of migrant workers in Qatar is something that's disgraceful. Obviously, there's also criticisms about the laws around LGBT rights. Of course, that's absolutely valid, but I do find it somewhat hypocritical for Western countries to have spent essentially 8 years since it was first awarded, 8 years singling out Qatar and saying that a World Cup can't be held in a country like Qatar, when the next World Cup is going to be held in the United States. And the United States is responsible for far more death and destruction around the world than Qatar ever has or ever will be. And there's absolutely zero criticism of that decision. Of course, people say, oh, well, you can criticize both. But the point is that people don't. The point is that the media will never, ever talk, for example, in England, when there was the opening ceremony, the BBC refused to show it, and they just had this guy Gary Lineker, who's a sort of liberal ex-footballer, just give a sort of moral lecture about human rights and things. And this is coming from the country that killed over 1 million civilians in Iraq. And will that presenter say anything at all when the World Cup is held in the United States? Of course he won't. He doesn't want to, and even if he did, he would probably get sacked for doing so if he did say something. But I think it's entirely hypocritical. There's also, I think, definitely a tinge of racism about it, because the criticism haven't only been about the issue of migrant workers and LGBT rights, but also people saying, essentially saying that you shouldn't hold a World Cup in that part of the world. Which is something that's completely racist. I think it's the World Cup. It's not just the European Cup or the American Cup. It should be held in every country of the world. I think it's fantastic that it's held in South Africa. I understand the only continent now that's it's not been held in is the one you're in, Oceania. Australia, that part of the world, and I'll be absolutely in favor of a World Cup being held there, so that it is in all corners of the world. And there's also been people in Europe saying, and the one see from people in England and football fans in England all the time is, how can they hold a World Cup in the winter? Of course, it isn't the winter in where both you and I are right now. In Argentina, it's not winter. In fact, people were able to celebrate last night in the streets, warm because it's not the winter. Half the world lives in countries where it's currently summer right now. Europe and North America are not the only countries on the planet, and this idea that no one else exists and that everyone else should have to accommodate the European season. And and that's the other thing they say. Oh, they're holding it mid-season because in Europe you have the seasons going from. I think the season started about sort of a few months ago, goes to about July or whatever. But in Latin America, in Argentina, for example, football season goes from January to about November. So it was perfect. It fits in perfectly to Argentina's season. But of course, the people don't think about that. People only think about it from a European perspective. So I think is absolutely ridiculous. And of course, more ridiculous of all is the idea that football should be the arena where you criticize these Gulf states and not in the actual political realm, because obviously these countries, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, they're allies of Western government. So where was the Western media then? I've seen interviews of, for example, in Manchester City, they're owned by the Saudis. You have like journalists, including even BBC journalists, asking players about, trying to get them to speak up about human rights abuses, for example, in Saudi Arabia. Well, why is it the responsibility of footballers? Why isn't it not the governments who arm these countries, who have close relationships with these countries? The worst of all was Germany, right? Germany came out, German national team on their first game, this just absolute virtue signaling about the issue of LGBT rights, because they weren't allowed to wear the LGBT armband. And they did a sort of pose, with their hand over their mouth, just saying, "Oh, we're being silenced." But then a few weeks later, the German government signs a liquid natural gas deal with Qatar. So will those players then protest to their own government? Of course they won't. So I think it's very, very hypocritical. A lot of it is nothing to do with the issue of workers and LGBT rights. A lot of it is just racism, I think, that people don't think a World Cup should be held in an Islamic country, in the Arab world. But I think, we probably won't hear as much about that now, because I think this has been a fantastic World Cup. People are going to recognize that, I think, at the end of this, which it is now the end of it.
Mm-hmm. Brazil, of course, were quite disappointing in this tournament, while Uruguay, as is often the case for the former two-time world champions, looked dangerous until they were eliminated. Mexico this time could not get into the second round, which in the past is where their World Cup campaign generally comes to an end. How did you view Latin American countries' performance in Qatar?
Well, I part of the reason I set up the show, because I knew this was going to be a Latin American, or should I say South American tournament. I think Argentina and Brazil were the strongest teams, along with obviously France going into this. But I think there's, at least in my lifetime, I've never seen such a strong South American representation compared to Europe. I think easily Brazil was better than Brazil and Argentina, I think, were better than every European team except France. Obviously, Argentina beat France, but I think that, France has a fantastic team. I think they're the only ones that could compete with the South American teams. But I say South America because, obviously, as you mentioned, Central America had quite a poor tournament. Mexico didn't qualify their group. Costa Rica didn't either. They did have some good games, but they were never going to qualify. I think it's that's partly because of the sporting cultures in Latin America. Because in South America, football is the only sport that exists, pretty much. There pretty much isn't really any other sport that people play. In Argentina, there's like sort of private school people and rich people play rugby. Argentina has quite a good rugby team. Polo is quite big as well, but that is only for a very, very small number of people, of very, very rich people. but the vast majority, 99% of people only play football. There's no other sport. And that is the same in every South American country. One sec. And yeah, and whereas in Central America is very different. Central America football is not necessarily the number one sport. A lot of Central American countries play baseball as their main sport. You've got countries like Cuba that have like boxing as their main sport. Yeah, Mexico is the outlier though, because Mexico is a football mad country. It is the number one sport, yet they consistently perform quite poorly, which I think is something they should reflect on without wanting to offend any Mexican listeners. All respect, and I love Mexico, but I think it's a shame that a country that's so large and that is so passionate about football, and Mexicans are extremely passionate about football. It's a shame that they can't produce a team that's on the level with some of the South American countries like Argentina and Brazil. The other South American countries, I think Uruguay were disappointing considering how good their team is. I think they have a fantastic team. They weren't able to qualify their group. Ecuador, I think, did fantastic. Ecuador is traditionally weaker than it's not as strong as countries like Argentina, Brazil. It's a much smaller country, but I think they did really well. They didn't qualify their group, but they did really well. Ecuadorian football and Ecuadorian league has much less money than the Argentinian or Brazilian leagues. So for them to be able to put out a fantastic team I think is a real achievement. By the way, about vast majority, about 9 out of the 11 players on the pitch are black Afro-Ecuadorians, and Afro-Ecuadorians are not a majority in Ecuador. They're not even half the country. They're a minority within Ecuador. Yet almost all of the players are Afro-Ecuadorian from sort of the coastal regions like Esmeraldas. It was a fantastic run for them. Obviously, they won the first match of the tournament, the opening game. That was really great. On the Submarine Football Show, we did it with an ex-Ecuadorian player. Is a keeper at a team called Deportivo Quito, professional. Man, I think it's been a fantastic tournament for South America, bar Uruguay. And in terms of Latin America, obviously Mexico, Costa Rica weren't able to qualify. And yeah, that's Central America has a very different culture to South America when it comes to sports.
I've got 2 more questions for you. During the last World Cup, one of the biggest criticisms of France was the fact that most of its players were of African heritage or were born in Africa and then nationalized in France in order for them to play for the national team. While some of these criticisms were mean-spirited and even racist, they did touch a nerve regarding the neo-colonial relationship France has with its former colonies. While French companies still extract resources from former colonies, in the area of football, it extracts talented footballers who, under other circumstances, would play for other countries. The same, of course, could be said for South American players who can be found all over the world playing either club or national football for other countries. What's your view of the relationship between football, money, and the connection between ex-colonies and their former imperial masters?
Yeah, definitely. Well, with the Morocco thing, we saw the reverse of this actually. A lot of the Moroccan players were born in Europe to immigrant parents, but then chose to play for Morocco, including the Hakimi, who scored the penalty that knocked out Spain, was born in Madrid to Moroccan parents, and he chose to play for Morocco and then knocked Spain out, which was quite funny, I think. And you do have cases of people that play, who perhaps grew up to immigrant parents but then play for their country of origin. But yes, obviously the France team is, a lot of the players are African heritage. South America is actually, I think, being robbed as well of another great team because most of the Dutch players, most of Holland's best players who are black, are from Suriname. Players like Virgil van Dijk, Cody Gakpo and things, their parents are from Suriname. And South America could have had a world-class team in Suriname if those players had chosen to play, for their parents' country. But yeah, obviously players have a right to choose. If you've grown up your whole life and you're born in a country, perhaps you want to play there. Obviously, England as well has players of Nigerian descent, Jamaican descent, and that obviously is reflective of the fact that those were British colonies. And then those, especially after World War II, they bring in migrant labor to rebuild the country. And yeah, but it shows the colonial nature of the legacy certainly still lives on. The issue of things like brain drain as well and immigration, the fact that Latin American countries and African countries lose a lot of this is educated workforce to the West. And in football you see that as well. In the best players of South America obviously play their club football in Europe because there's a lot more money there. There's especially outside Argentina and Brazil, countries like Ecuador or Bolivia, or Chile, there's very, very football players aren't paid well at all. They earn a fraction of what they do in Europe. There isn't the money in the game. There isn't enough money as well to develop talent. Players like Messi were from the age of a young boy was in Barcelona, trained in the Barcelona system in Spain. How much opportunity would he have had in Argentina? We don't know. But yeah, it's a shame. And yeah, so I'm someone who loves South American football. I love watching Argentinian and Brazilian leagues. And it's always a shame that as soon as you get a great player coming through, they're immediately snapped up by a Real Madrid or a Manchester United or whatever. And it's a shame, but because there's just not the money here, and all of the talent ends up being sucked out, particularly by the English Premier League. So, but yeah, that's it just shows that football is not something that's separate from the rest of society.
Mm-hmm. An Australian journalist has been tagging me in his tweets regarding his criticisms of FIFA and what he sees as the attempted Americanization of football. He noted how some of the terms in the game have been changed to suit US audiences, or at least he attempts to make that argument. This battle, of course, has been taking place for a long time since the USA held the World Cup in 1994. What's your take on this battle? And do you think football can become a major sport in the United States without losing, I guess, some of its key elements or its essence?
Well, one of the criticisms that people made about Qatar was that, Qatar's not a footballing country, which, first of all, football is an international sport. It doesn't matter where you're from to be able to play it. But also the fact that the United States is not a football country. Soccer, as they call it, is not the biggest sport. It's the sport that's played largely by middle class people, which is very different to South America and even in Europe, where it is a more working class sport. As you say, you can even play with a plastic bottle, put two jumpers to the goalpost, and that's how a lot of people in South America come up playing. It's low point of entry, low cost of entry, whereas in the United States, very different. It's much more middle class thing, and when you have a sport that's more for middle class people, you don't get the best people going into it because people who are middle class, once they get to 17, 18 years old, their parents will likely encourage them to go to university rather than pursue sport. Whereas in Europe and South America, for a lot of people, it's their only option, and they know that it's all or nothing. You either make it or can continue to live in poverty like their parents and their parents before that. And that is, one, there's a lot more people in terms of quantity, but also it's more drive. And so I think America is unlikely to become a power in football for that reason. Also, I've seen a lot of Americans say that if Americans cared enough, they could become the best sporting nation on the planet because they have great athletes and things. But of course, football is not about being the most, the biggest muscle. In fact, having huge muscles is something that is not advantageous in football because it's something that slows you down. In football, you need agility, you need a technical skill, speed. Not, you won't see many footballers with sort of giant muscles ever, or that are excessively tall. Lionel Messi is about 5'7". So sort of a basketball type player that's like 7 foot. That's someone that's never going to make it in football because they're not going to have the agility and technical skill required. So it's a very different sport to the sorts of sports they play in the United States. So I don't think the US is going to become a power anytime soon.
Ollie Vargas, thank you very much for speaking to us here at Alborada's Indestructible podcast. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo.
As always, I would like to thank Alborada for this opportunity to host Indestructible. Once again, I would encourage our listeners to support this podcast on Patreon, which you can do for as little as the price of 1 cup of coffee per month. My sincere thanks, as always, goes to Alborada's founder and co-editor, Pablo Navarrete, who produces this podcast. If you have any comments on this episode, please write to us on our email, which you will find on Alborada's website.